It was snowing that night. Not the kind of snow you admire from a warm window, but the kind that stings your face and settles deep in your bones. I remember standing at my own front door, or what used to be my front door, holding a suitcase that had more years than dollars inside. The porch light flickered, the one I'd fixed myself a dozen times, and behind that door was my son. 6 months ago, I sold that very house to save him. Tonight, he was the one who locked me out. They say a man never forgets the sound of his child's first cry. I wonder if he ever forgets the sound of that same child saying, "You don't live here anymore." The world doesn't prepare you for that kind of silence, the silence after your own blood shuts the door on you. I used to tell Evan that every storm passes if you keep the porch light on. It was something his mother used to say before the cancer took her when he was 15. Maybe that's why I kept fixing that same light over and over. It wasn't just a bulb to me. It was a promise that no matter how dark things got, home would always be waiting for him. Funny thing about promises. They don't melt in the snow, but they can freeze over time. I can still see him, that little boy in the backyard, running around with a baseball glove too big for his hand. "Dad, watch me." God, how many times did I say, "I'm watching, son"? And I always was. Every school concert, every late-night fever, every broken thing he didn't know how to fix. So when the addiction came, I watched again. At first like a worried father, then like a man helplessly staring at a slow-moving train wreck. He'd come home shaking, sweating, swearing he was fine. I wanted to believe him. Parents like me, we cling to hope like it's oxygen. Because the moment we stop believing, it feels like we've already buried them. The night he told me he needed money for rehab, I didn't hesitate, didn't even think. That's the thing about love, it doesn't ask for logic, it just bleeds. I sold the house within a week. 25 years of life boxed up and handed over to strangers. The walls still smelled like his mother's apple pie when I signed the papers. I remember the look on his face when I told him. He cried, hugged me, said I saved his life. And I believed him. That was 6 months ago. 6 months of motel rooms and cheap coffee. 6 months of waiting for my son to call. And now here I was, standing outside in the snow, watching my breath rise like smoke against the window that used to show our Christmas tree. When he opened the door, he looked different. Older, harder. There were dark circles under his eyes and a new kind of distance in his voice. "Dad," he said, "you shouldn't have come." "I just wanted to see you," I told him. "I thought maybe we could have dinner, talk." He looked past me, like I was someone selling magazines. "This isn't your place anymore," he said flatly. "The deed's under my name now, I can't have you showing up like this." For a moment I thought he was joking. The words felt too cold to be real. But then he added quietly, almost rehearsed, "You made your choice, Dad, let me live mine." Then the door closed, just like that. You ever notice how snow makes everything quiet? That kind of quiet where even your heartbeat sounds too loud. I stood there for a long time, long enough for my fingers to go numb. Long enough to remember every bedtime story, every packed lunch, every time I told him I'd never give up on him. And still he gave up on me. I didn't cry, not right away. Men my age, we learn to save our tears for when no one's watching. But as I turned and walked down that frozen path, I felt something inside me crack. Not anger, not even heartbreak. Just a hollow sort of understanding that maybe love isn't about how much you give. Maybe it's about knowing when you've given enough. Halfway to the street, I looked back. The house was glowing from the inside, warm and alive, but it wasn't mine anymore. And maybe, truthfully, it never was, because a home isn't made of walls and windows. It's made of people who let you in. And that night my son didn't. So I kept walking, past the mailbox still with my name on it, past the tree we planted when Evan was 5, each step sinking deeper into the snow. If you'd asked me back then whether I regretted selling that house, I would have said no. A father shouldn't regret saving his child. But standing there in that cold, my breath fading into the night, I realized something I'd never dared to think before. Maybe some sacrifices aren't meant to save. They're meant to teach us what love shouldn't cost. That was the night I learned the hardest truth of all. When compassion becomes a weapon, it cuts both ways. And somewhere behind that locked door, my son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders, was losing himself to a darkness I couldn't buy him out of anymore. Would I still do it all again? Maybe, because that's what fathers do. We break ourselves one piece at a time, hoping our sons will learn how to stay whole. But sometimes they just don't. 6 months earlier, I used to think a house was just wood and nails, something you pay off, patch up, and eventually walk away from. But some houses keep what you leave behind: the laughter, the smell of supper, the echo of a voice that no longer answers. This one did. When I first walked through its doorway 27 years ago, the air smelled faintly of sawdust and rain. The floors creaked, the paint was chipped, and the yard looked like a bad haircut. But my wife, Claire, saw something else. She walked straight to the kitchen window, sunlight catching her hair, and said, "Frank, can you imagine Evan playing out there?" I could, and that was enough. We bought it with every dime we didn't have. Back then, we weren't building a dream, we were building hope. Every weekend, I'd be out there with a hammer, and Claire would be inside painting walls the color of warm sand. Evan, barely 3, would toddle around with a plastic tool set, helping Daddy. His little hammer left marks on the baseboards that I never bothered to fix. Those dents were the first things that made the house ours. I remember the sound of the washing machine in the evenings, the hum of the fridge, the soft crackle of the old radio Claire loved. Ordinary sounds, but when you put them together, they made a rhythm, the heartbeat of a home. After Claire died, that rhythm changed. The laughter faded. The kitchen grew quieter, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. But I couldn't leave. I told myself it was for Evan, that he needed the same roof, the same backyard, the same smell of cinnamon in winter. Maybe it was really me who needed those things. Grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like a man fixing the same leaky faucet 3 times because he can't fix the emptiness inside him. I started collecting the little things that made us feel alive again. A new coat of blue paint for the shutters. An apple tree in the back, planted where the old one had died. Evan and I built a tree house that leaned too far to one side, but he called it perfect, and that was enough. On summer nights, we'd sit out there with cold lemonade and talk about the future. He'd tell me he wanted to study architecture one day, build something people could live their whole lives in. I told him he already had. Years later, when he got into college, I remember the day we packed his things. The house looked bigger without his laughter bouncing off the walls. That evening, after dropping him off, I came home and stood in his empty room. The posters, the trophies, the faint smell of his cologne still hanging in the air. I sat on the edge of his bed, and the silence felt proud, not lonely. That was before the addiction came, before phone calls in the middle of the night and the strange tremor in his voice when he said he was fine. But back then, in that brief window of peace, I believed the house had done its job. It had raised a boy, kept him safe, and held our family together through every storm. I thought that was what homes were meant to do. Winters in that house were my favorite. The windows would frost over, and the whole world outside looked soft, forgiving. Claire used to bake her cinnamon bread, and even after she was gone, I kept her recipe taped inside the cabinet. On Christmas mornings, I'd still light the same candle she always did, the one that smelled like orange and cloves. Evan would laugh and say, "Mom would have told you to stop getting sentimental." He didn't know that lighting it was the only way I could still talk to her. The scent of that candle became the smell of survival. Even now, I swear I catch it sometimes in the strangest places, a diner, a bus station, and for a second I'm back there in that kitchen, hearing her hum along to Nat King Cole. I never told anyone, but when I signed the deed to sell the house, my hand shook so hard I couldn't finish my name. The realtor thought I was nervous. But it wasn't nerves, it was grief. Because every nail I'd hammered, every wall I'd painted, every night I'd spent fixing broken things, they were all built for one purpose: to give my son something solid when the world fell apart. And the cruel part, that's exactly what I sold. When people talk about losing a home, they think of eviction or foreclosure. But the real loss comes when the memories no longer belong to you. When the walls that once echoed your laughter now hold someone else's silence. When the doorknob you polished for years becomes just another handle to strangers. Still, I don't regret building that house, because for a long time it held everything good about us. It carried the smell of Sunday pancakes, the warmth of small victories, the sound of my boys' feet running down the stairs. Even when things got dark, the house stayed gentle, like it was trying to remind me. This is what love feels like, steady, even when you're not. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I close my eyes and walk through those rooms again. I can feel the texture of the old banister, the coolness of the kitchen tiles under my bare feet, the draft that always came through the east window in spring. It's strange, memory doesn't age like the body does. It keeps things alive in their best light. And though I can't step inside that house anymore, I still carry its weight, the warmth of it, the ache of it. Because long before I sold the walls, I'd already built something that couldn't be taken, a kind of love that tried and failed but still remembers how to stay. It didn't happen all at once. Addiction rarely announces itself with a bang. It creeps in quietly, a flicker in the eyes, a hesitation in the voice, a shadow that lingers too long after the laughter fades. The first time I noticed something off with Evan, it was spring. The kind of spring where the world looks new again, even for a man who's seen too many seasons. The dogwoods were blooming white across our street, and the smell of cut grass drifted through the window. He'd come home from college for a few weeks, his arm in a sling after that car accident. He said it wasn't serious. Just a few stitches and some pain meds, no big deal. I wanted to believe him. He smiled like always, but there was a glaze behind his eyes, like someone had drawn a curtain just thin enough to blur the boy I knew. He slept late that summer, too late. Sometimes I'd find him sitting in the kitchen at noon, coffee gone cold, staring through the window without really seeing anything. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd shake his head, that same polite smile he used when he was a teenager and didn't want to talk. One morning I heard the sound of glass breaking in the bathroom. He came out pale, sweating, his hands trembling slightly, said he dropped his toothbrush, but I saw the pill bottle on the counter, half empty, label peeled away. My stomach went tight, a quiet alarm I tried to muffle with denial. You tell yourself your kid's responsible. You tell yourself he's just in pain, that the doctor knows what he's doing. You tell yourself anything that keeps the fear from growing teeth. Then came the missing cash. The late-night calls from unknown numbers. The way he flinched when I asked simple questions. It was like watching someone move behind a pane of glass, close enough to touch, yet already gone. The house changed too. The air grew heavier, quieter. The kitchen table, once covered in half-finished projects and takeout boxes, started to feel like a waiting room. Even the sound of the clock ticking became sharp, accusatory. I remember one night he came home around 3 a.m. The headlights swept across the walls like searchlights. When he stepped inside, the smell hit me, sharp, chemical, wrong. He froze when he saw me sitting on the couch. "Rough night?" I asked. He tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "Yeah, just hanging out with some friends." His hands were shaking as he untied his shoes. I didn't say a word, but I saw the truth trembling in his fingers, twitching in his jaw, and I knew. I spent the next few weeks pretending I didn't. Cooking dinners he didn't eat. Asking questions he didn't answer. Parents of addicts become experts in silence. We learn to measure love in patience and denial, to smile while the ground shifts under us. One afternoon I came home early from work. He was in the garage, door half closed, music blasting too loud. The smell of gasoline and something else, something burnt, hung in the air. He jumped when he saw me. Behind him, on the workbench, was a small glass pipe. And that's when the light I'd been pretending not to see finally went out. We didn't yell that day. There was no storm, no thrown plates, no slamming doors. Just quiet, heavy, crushing quiet. I remember his face, the way his eyes darted away from mine. He didn't look guilty, he looked lost. I wanted to reach out, to shake him, to tell him this wasn't who he was, but the words stuck in my throat, because part of me knew once you lose that light, you can't just switch it back on. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house barefoot, the floorboards cold under my feet. The moonlight pooled across the hallway like water. I stopped outside his door. It was cracked open, and I could hear him breathing, slow, uneven, like a child having a bad dream. For a moment I saw him the way he used to be, little boy, blanket pulled up to his chin, mumbling in his sleep. I whispered, "I'm here, buddy." Even though I knew he couldn't hear me anymore, not really. Days turned into months. The lies grew smoother, the excuses sharper. I found new pill bottles hidden in the cereal box, behind the toilet tank, under his mattress. When I confronted him, he'd cry, swear it was over, promise he'd stop. And I wanted to believe him every single time. Because love, real love, makes fools of us. But every promise he made started to sound the same, like an echo in an empty room. And each time he broke one, something in me chipped away. There's a kind of heartbreak that doesn't make noise. It doesn't come from betrayal or loss. It comes from watching someone you love fade inch by inch while you stand helpless on the other side. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at old photos, him and his mother in the backyard, the two of them laughing. For a moment his face would soften, and I'd see the light flicker again, small, fragile, almost there. Then it would vanish, swallowed by whatever ghost had its hands on him. That was when I realized addiction isn't just a sickness, it's a thief. It steals slowly, politely, one piece of the soul at a time, until one day you wake up and the person you love is just gone. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of the end. The night I stood outside his door and whispered into the dark, that was the last time I spoke to the boy I raised. After that, it was someone else living in his skin. Someone I didn't recognize. Someone who would one day look me in the eye and call me a stranger. And maybe, deep down, I already knew it. Because even as I held on, the light in his eyes had already gone out. And the house that built our dreams was starting to feel like a place where love went to die. The first time I said the word rehab out loud, it felt foreign in my mouth, like something meant for other people's tragedies, not mine. But there I was, standing in the kitchen, phone in one hand, a folded pamphlet in the other, reading about treatment options and family involvement. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. The light from the window fell across the counter where Claire used to bake. Now it was covered in papers, insurance forms, names of clinics, promises printed in glossy ink. Evan came downstairs late that morning. His hair was damp, eyes half open, moving slower than he used to. "Morning," I said carefully, pretending it was just another day. He grunted, grabbed a glass, and filled it with water. I wanted to ease into it, to sound calm, but my voice came out too tight. "Son, I talked to a counselor today, just to see what we could." He cut me off. "Dad, no." The glass hit the counter harder than he meant. "I told you I've got it under control." Control. It was a word that used to mean something. Now it felt like a lie people told themselves right before everything broke. The weeks that followed were a blur of cautious conversations and slammed doors. Every time I tried to help, he built another wall. I called his friends, the few he still had, asked them to talk to him. One hung up. Another said quietly, "He won't listen, Mr. Carter, not yet." So I decided to do what parents do when logic fails. I gathered everyone who still loved him and I planned an intervention. It was a gray afternoon in early October. The air smelled like wet leaves and distant rain. I invited his aunt, our family doctor, and his childhood friend Nate. We rehearsed what to say, soft words, no accusations, just truth. I set chairs in a circle in the living room, the one with the faded rug and the photograph of him and Claire by the fireplace. When Evan walked in, he froze. His face went blank, that careful, guarded look addicts wear when they sense a trap. "Son," I said, standing slowly, "we just want to talk." He laughed once, short, bitter. "Talk or lecture?" "Listen," his aunt said gently. "We're worried about you. You've lost weight. You've missed work. We just want—" I said, "I'm fine." He snapped, voice cracking halfway through. Nate tried to step in, voice calm. "Evan, man, I've been there. It's not about blame. It's about getting your life back." That's when Evan's hands began to shake. He turned on me, eyes glassy, jaw tight. "You called them here. You think this is helping. Please, son, just hear us out," I begged. "We can get you into a program tomorrow. I'll take care of everything, the bills, the transport." "Bills?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, right, money fixes everything, doesn't it, Dad?" The room went still. The clock ticked once, twice. I could hear my own heartbeat echo in the silence. He started pacing, muttering under his breath. I could see the sweat forming at his temples, the restless twitch in his jaw. Every movement screamed panic, the kind that hides pain behind anger. "You always think you know better," he said. "You think I don't see it. You looking at me like I'm some project to fix." "Evan," I whispered, "I just want my son back." He stopped. For a moment, the hardness in his face cracked. And there it was, the boy who used to build Lego towers on this same floor, the boy who hugged me after his first heartbreak. But the moment passed. His expression hardened again, voice rising. "You want your son back, then stop treating me like a failure." He grabbed his jacket from the chair, knocking over a glass that shattered on the tile. The sound sliced through the room like a gunshot. I took a step toward him. "Evan, please." He shook his head, eyes burning. "I don't need your help. I don't need you." Then he was gone, door slamming, tires screeching, leaving the scent of exhaust and rain behind. The room stayed quiet long after. Nate stood by the window, staring at nothing. His aunt wiped her eyes. The doctor patted my shoulder and said softly, "You did the right thing." But it didn't feel like it. The right thing isn't supposed to sound like glass breaking. I picked up the pieces from the floor one by one. Some were clear, others tinged with his fingerprints. Each shard caught the light like a small, sharp truth. By the time I threw them away, my hands were trembling. Tiny cuts stung along my fingers, little reminders that love, when desperate, can wound you too. That night the rain came harder. It drummed against the windows, steady and relentless. I sat in the dark, the pamphlet still on the table. The words blurred together. Detox, recovery, relapse prevention. Each one felt like a promise I didn't know how to keep. I tried calling him over and over, straight to voicemail. Then finally a text. "Stop calling me. I'm fine. No name, no heart." Just 3 words and the kind of finality that only addicts can deliver, the illusion of control in a world already spinning. I lay awake until morning, listening to the storm fade. The house smelled like damp wood and fear. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed, low, mournful, fading into nothing. And for the first time since Claire died, I prayed. Not for strength, for wisdom, just for one more chance to see the light come back into my son's eyes. But deep down beneath the prayer was a truth I couldn't face yet. Some storms don't pass. They just teach you how to stand in the rain. It was late January when he came back. The kind of winter where the cold doesn't just bite, it burrows. I remember the sound of the doorbell that night, slow, hesitant. When I opened it, Evan was standing there, snow dusting his shoulders, face pale beneath a week's worth of stubble. He smiled, or tried to. "Hey, Dad." Those 2 words nearly undid me. It had been weeks since the failed intervention, weeks of silence, of unanswered calls and nights spent replaying what I could have said differently. He stepped inside, stamping his boots. "I've been clean," he said too quickly. "I swear I'm going to meetings. I've got this new start coming." I wanted to believe him. God help me, I did. Sat at the kitchen table, the one with the small burn mark from a long-ago birthday candle. He rubbed his hands together, avoiding my eyes. "Dad, there's this program out west," he said. "Private. They've got counselors, work therapy, the whole thing. It's real, but it's expensive." His voice cracked just enough to sound honest. "I can't get in without a deposit. They said they'll hold a spot if I wire the money by Monday." He slid a crumpled brochure across the table, glossy photos of smiling people on a beach. The logo at the top looked professional enough to make hope sound practical. I glanced at it, my pulse heavy in my ears. "How much?" He hesitated, then said it, "A number too big for the savings account that held my retirement and the remainder from the insurance after Claire died. Over 100,000, almost everything I had left." When I didn't answer right away, he reached for my hand. "Dad, please. This is my chance. I'll pay you back, I swear I will." I don't remember deciding. I remember the feeling, that mixture of fear and love that makes a parent's chest tighten until reason loses its breath. I remember his mother's voice in my head. "He's our boy. Don't give up on him." The next morning I was sitting in the bank, pen in hand. The air smelled like disinfectant and cheap coffee. A heater clicked somewhere, the sound of money-counting machines whirring faintly in the distance. The teller smiled politely as she slid the paperwork toward me. "Are you sure you want to withdraw the full amount, Mr. Carter?" I nodded. My throat felt dry. "Yes, it's for my son." The words left a trace of warmth in my mouth, but it burned on the way down. That night when I handed him the check, he hugged me tight, tighter than he had in years. "Thank you," he whispered into my shoulder. "You won't regret this." I held on for a moment longer, afraid that if I let go too soon, he might disappear again. When he finally pulled away, he looked lighter somehow, relieved. It was the first time in months I'd seen color return to his face. "Go get better," I said softly. "That's all I want." He smiled, tucked the check carefully into his jacket, and left. The door closed gently behind him, almost tenderly, like a promise. For the next few days I allowed myself to believe in miracles. I imagined him boarding a plane, meeting counselors, sleeping in a clean bed. I pictured him walking along a sunlit coast somewhere, shoulders straight, eyes clear again. But the phone never rang. The house stayed quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock that always seemed to run slower when you're waiting for good news. By the end of the week, that hope began to rot into worry. I called the rehab center listed on the brochure. A woman answered, her tone brisk and businesslike. "I'm sorry, sir," she said after checking. "We don't have an Evan Carter registered here." I told her she must be mistaken, spelled the name twice. She paused. "Sir, we've never had that name in our records, and our brochure doesn't look like the one you're describing." My hand went cold around the phone. When I hung up, the silence felt like the air before thunder. That night, I drove through town, the side streets, the old parking lot behind the diner, the dim alleys behind the bowling alley where he used to meet friends. The snow had turned to sleet, slapping against the windshield in thin, angry streaks. Every shadow looked like him. Every figure I passed made my heart jump and fall again. I didn't find him. What I did find the next morning was the empty envelope from the check left on the table where he'd sat. Inside it was a note, one line written in his uneven handwriting. "I'll make this right, Dad." No signature, no number. I read it so many times the paper went soft between my fingers. For a week after, I kept telling myself the money was helping him, that he was somewhere safe. But deep down, I knew, the way parents always know when something sacred has been betrayed. At night, I'd wake up thinking I heard footsteps on the porch, that maybe he'd come back. But it was always the wind, moving through the old siding like a sigh. The house smelled faintly of cold air and regret. I'd sit at the table, look at the empty chair across from me, and try to remember the feel of his hug. That moment before I let go of the check, before I gave away the last thing that still belonged to us both. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face that night, calm, practiced, grateful. And the way he slipped the check into his pocket without trembling. That's when I realized the truth. It wasn't just money I'd given him. It was trust. And that, more than the house, more than the savings, was what truly broke me. Silence has a way of stretching time. It doesn't tick like a clock or fade like a song. It lingers, heavy and shapeless, until it becomes part of you. After Evan left with the check, the house felt too big. The air seemed to echo differently, his absence filling every corner. For the first few days, I kept the TV on just to hear another voice. The sound of weather reports and late-night commercials became company. I told myself he'd call soon, that the silence was just part of recovery. He didn't call. I marked each day with small rituals: morning coffee, a walk to the mailbox, a look at my phone that stayed blank. The seasons began to turn, slow and indifferent. February melted into March. The snow outside the window gave way to mud, then pale grass. Each sunrise arrived with the same question: where is he now? Sometimes I'd dial his number, let it ring until the voicemail picked up. "Hey, it's Evan, leave a message." I never did. Hearing his voice, even recorded, was enough to stop my words in their throat. By April, I moved into a small motel near the edge of town, a place that smelled faintly of bleach and cigarette smoke. It was cheaper than keeping up the house alone, and I told myself I'd only stay until he came back. The manager, a woman named Dolores, gave me the same room every month. Room 12, second floor, thin walls. You could hear the pipes groan whenever someone showered. I'd sit on the edge of the bed at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of a vending machine down the hall. Every sound felt distant, like life happening somewhere else. Sometimes I'd dream about the house. I'd see Claire standing by the kitchen window, sunlight in her hair, calling Evan's name. But when I reached the door, it wouldn't open. The handle was always too cold to turn. I tried to keep busy, fixing small things for neighbors, changing tires, trimming hedges, repairing gutters no one else wanted to climb. It kept my hands from shaking, kept my mind from wandering too far into the dark. Each dollar I earned went into a coffee tin in my suitcase, money I told myself I'd use when Evan came back and needed a fresh start. He was always going to come back. That's what I told myself anyway. In May, I ran into Nate at the grocery store. He was standing by the canned goods aisle, wearing the same baseball cap he'd worn since high school. When he saw me, his face tightened, that awkward blend of pity and caution. "Hey, Mr. Carter," he said softly. "You heard from him lately?" I shook my head. Nate nodded, staring down at his shoes. "I saw him a few weeks ago," he murmured. "Downtown. He didn't look good." The words fell heavy like wet concrete. I wanted to ask more, where, with whom, doing what, but I couldn't. The questions stayed lodged behind my ribs. I just thanked him and walked away, leaving the cart half full. That night, I sat in the car outside a convenience store until dawn, scanning every face that passed through the parking lot. Every time someone in a hooded jacket walked by, my heart jumped. But it was never him. Summer came early that year. The air thickened with the smell of asphalt and distant rain. I drove past the old neighborhood one evening, slowing as I reached the turn that led to our street. The house stood there, quiet, the shutters drawn. I pulled over and sat for a while, engine running, windows down. The garden had gone wild, weeds climbing the fence, grass up to the knees. The mailbox still had our name on it, Carter. I don't know why, but I got out and ran my hand over the letters. The metal was warm from the sun, but it felt hollow beneath my fingers. A neighbor came out, someone new, holding a bag of trash. She looked at me politely, uncertain, and asked, "Can I help you?" I shook my head, forcing a smile. "No, just passing through." I left before she could ask more. By July, even the silence started to change. It wasn't empty anymore, it had texture. The hum of air conditioners, the distant whir of cicadas, the steady rhythm of loneliness settling in. I'd catch myself talking to Claire sometimes. Not out loud, but in that half-whisper people use when they're not sure anyone's listening. I'd tell her I'd done everything I could, that I'd given him every chance. One night I found myself driving again, this time to the small diner on the highway where Evan used to love pancakes as a kid. The booths were cracked, the air smelled like burnt coffee and maple syrup. I sat in our old corner, staring at the plate in front of me until the waitress asked if I was waiting for someone. I didn't answer. It was around then that I stopped checking the phone every hour, stopped leaving the porch light on, stopped pretending that silence meant healing, because 6 months had passed. 6 months since he'd walked out with that check and promised to make things right. And every day since then had been another quiet reminder that sometimes love doesn't fix people. It just waits and waits until it turns into something else. Not anger, not even grief. Just a dull ache that hums beneath your ribs like a song you can't forget but no longer want to hear. And in that ache, I finally understood something I hadn't before. That maybe the hardest part of being a father isn't losing your child. It's learning how to live in the silence after they are gone. Late August. The air was heavy, the kind that carries endings in it. It was late August when I finally decided to go back. 6 months since I'd last seen him. 6 months since that check left my hands and took everything that mattered with it. The motel room had started to feel like a waiting room for a life that wasn't coming back. So that morning, without much thought, I packed the few things I owned, a flannel shirt, an old photograph, my worn Bible, and drove toward the house. The air outside shimmered with heat. Cicadas screamed from the trees, their sound steady and relentless, as if to warn me that I was walking straight into something I couldn't undo. The closer I got, the slower I drove. The street looked the same, but not really. The trees were taller, the paint on the fences more faded. Some of the faces had changed, young families, new cars, laughter spilling out from driveways that used to know ours. And then, at the end of the lane, there it was, the house, our house. It looked smaller than I remembered and yet heavier somehow, like it had learned to keep secrets. The shutters were half closed, the yard unkempt, and the flower bed where Claire once planted marigolds was overrun with weeds. But what caught my eye wasn't any of that. It was the glint of metal on the front door, a new lock, shiny, brass, one I hadn't installed. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. It was a strange thing to stare at something you built with your own hands and realize it no longer belonged to you. The windows were closed tight, curtains drawn. Still, I could almost hear echoes, laughter, the clatter of dinner plates, Claire humming while washing dishes. Memory has a cruel way of pretending it's still real. Finally, I stepped out of the car. The pavement was hot under my boots. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and summer dust. Each step toward that front porch felt heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My reflection wavered faintly in the small brass circle of the lock. I raised my hand, knocked once. Then again, nothing. I tried the handle. It didn't move. I leaned closer, called out quietly, "Evan, it's me." The silence that answered was thick, almost physical. Somewhere inside, I heard faint movement, maybe a chair scraping, a floorboard creaking. My heart kicked. I knocked harder. "Evan, open up, son. I just want to talk." The door opened halfway, a chain still fastened across the frame. He stood there, eyes dull, hair longer, skin pale in the dim hallway light. He looked thinner, older, like life had drained some color from him. Behind him, the air smelled faintly of smoke and something sour. "Dad," he said, as if testing the word. Relief hit me so fast it almost made me dizzy. "Yeah, it's me. I've been trying to reach you." I smiled, hoping it might soften him. "Thought I'd stop by, see how you're doing, maybe grab some lunch, my treat." He didn't smile back. Instead, his eyes darted past me to the street, scanning like a man on the run. "This isn't a good time," he muttered. "You shouldn't have come." I took a step closer, but the chain held between us like a sentence. "Evan, please, I just need to know you're okay." "I'm fine," he said flatly. Then, almost under his breath, "You can't be here." I frowned. "Can't be here? What are you talking about? This is my house." He flinched at that, jaw tightening. "No, Dad, it's not." Something cold crawled up my spine. "What do you mean it's not?" He exhaled, eyes flicking away. "The deed's under my name now. You signed it over when you sold it, remember? The paperwork's done. It's legal." My stomach twisted. "I sold it to help you, not to be shut out of it." He didn't answer. The silence that followed was worse than shouting could have been. Through the narrow opening I saw enough: bottles scattered on the table, blinds half torn, the faint flicker of a TV in the background. It wasn't the home I'd built. It was something hollow wearing its skin. "Son," I whispered, "what happened to you?" He looked at me, then really looked. For a split second I thought I saw something break in him, but it passed like a shadow. His voice dropped lower. "Dad, please just go." I shook my head. "Not until you talk to me." His hand went to the chain. He didn't slam the door, he just closed it slowly, like mercy. I pressed my palm against the wood as it shut. "Evan," the click of the latch cut me off. A final sound, sharp, metallic, final. I stood there for a long time, hands still on the door. The sun had started to fall behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the yard. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, then stopped. I felt the sweat cool on my neck, a bead of it tracing down my spine. I wanted to knock again, to shout, to beg, but my voice wouldn't come. It felt like all the air had gone out of the world, so I just stood there listening. The faint murmur of the TV inside, the hum of a refrigerator, the quiet rhythm of my own heart breaking. Then I turned, walked down the steps and back to the car. As I reached for the door handle, I glanced back one last time. The porch light flickered once, then went dark. I got in, started the engine, and sat there with my hands gripping the wheel. Through the windshield I could still see the house, standing silent against the dying sky, and all I could think was how strange it felt to be locked out of something you built. Not just a home, but a life. Because that's the thing about love. Sometimes the people you'd open every door for are the same ones who teach you what a lock is for. That night, I didn't drive far. I made it as far as the gas station at the edge of town before the weight of everything caught up to me. The car's heater rattled weakly, blowing lukewarm air that smelled faintly of old rubber and gasoline. I sat there for a long time, engine running, watching the snow start to fall again, thin flakes under the yellow glow of the station lights, landing softly on the windshield before melting into nothing. It was quiet inside the car. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, the small sounds your body makes just to prove you're still here. I didn't have anywhere else to go. The motel had been cleared out that morning, new management, new rules, no long-term stays. Everything I owned fit in the backseat. A suitcase, a blanket, a few tools, and a coffee tin that used to rattle with coins but was mostly empty now. For the first time in my life, I realized I was technically homeless. It's a strange word when you've spent half your life building a home. It doesn't hit all at once. It seeps in slowly, like cold air through a cracked window. You start thinking about small things first: where to sleep, where to wash, how to stay invisible enough so no one calls the cops. I drove until I found a spot behind the old lumber yard. The lot was half frozen, littered with scraps of plywood and tire tracks hardened into the dirt. I parked between two abandoned trailers, turned off the headlights, and pulled the blanket over my legs. The air smelled faintly of rust and pine tar. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then stopped. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I saw his face, that look in his eyes when he shut the door on me. It wasn't anger, it was something colder: indifference. A father can survive many things: loss, regret, even betrayal, but indifference cuts the deepest, because it means you don't matter anymore. You're just noise fading into the background. I lay there, staring at the roof of the car, counting the tiny chips in the paint, listening to the faint ticking of cooling metal. When the wind picked up, the car rocked slightly, creaking like an old ship adrift. In the morning the frost had crawled across the windshield in thin, white veins. I wiped a small circle clear with my sleeve and watched the sun rise behind the warehouses. It wasn't beautiful, just pale light against a gray sky, but for some reason it still felt like something worth witnessing. I drove to a diner on the highway and ordered the cheapest breakfast they had. The waitress didn't ask questions. She just poured the coffee, set down a plate of eggs, and gave me that quiet nod reserved for people who have clearly been knocked down by life. The coffee was burnt, but it was hot, and for a few minutes that was enough. When I reached for my wallet, she stopped me. "On the house," she said softly. "Seen you around here before. You look like you could use a warm meal." I wanted to refuse, pride's a hard habit to kill, but instead I just said, "Thank you." Her kindness stung more than the cold outside. After breakfast, I drove aimlessly, past schools, past playgrounds, past lives that still had rhythm. I parked near a small park on the edge of town, watching kids toss a football while their parents shouted from the sidelines. For a moment, I saw myself in Evan years ago, his laughter, his clumsy throws, the way he'd look over to make sure I was watching. That simple, wordless connection. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles pale. Where did that go? How did we move from that boy to this stranger behind a locked door? I didn't have answers, just the bitter taste of what ifs. By the second week, I learned the routines of surviving without an address. Which gas stations wouldn't ask questions if you parked overnight. Which restrooms stayed unlocked after midnight. How to fold your jacket under your head just right so you don't wake up with a sore neck. Sometimes I'd park near the church downtown. They left the side door open for anyone who needed shelter. Inside, it smelled of old wood and candle wax. I'd sit in the back pew, head bowed, pretending to pray. Truth was, I didn't know who I was talking to anymore. I'd ask questions that went unanswered, or maybe the answers came too softly for me to hear. Why him? Why me? Why this silence between us that feels wider than death? One evening, as I sat in the car eating a sandwich I'd bought with loose change, a man knocked on the window. He looked about my age, face weathered, eyes kind. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. We talked for a while. His name was Carl. He'd lost his job, his marriage, then his home. He told me with a small smile, "You'd be surprised how quickly everything you own can fit into a trunk." When I didn't reply, he added, "It's not the sleeping in the car that's hard. It's waking up and remembering why you're there." He left me a blanket before walking off, thin, frayed at the edges, but clean. I still have it. Sometimes kindness from strangers feels more solid than love from blood. As the nights grew colder, I started counting the breaths that fogged the window, 1, 2, 3, until the glass cleared again. That became my rhythm, my proof of life. Somewhere, not far from me, my son was sleeping in the house I built, under the roof I paid for, behind a door I could no longer open, and me. I was just a shadow drifting through parking lots and back roads, carrying a heart too heavy for its body. But every night before I closed my eyes, I still whispered his name, quietly, like a prayer half remembered, because even when love is broken, it still has a pulse. And mine, for better or worse, still beat for him. Tomorrow I'd try one last door. The first cold rain of November came without warning. Not the soft kind that whispers against windows. This one fell hard, relentless, drumming on the car roof like a punishment. By nightfall, my blanket was damp, my hands stiff from the cold. The heater had stopped working 2 days ago, and the last of the gas was running out. I sat parked behind the grocery store, watching puddles ripple under the flickering streetlight. Every few minutes, a gust of wind would rattle the trash cans, and I'd flinch like a man expecting bad news. I hadn't eaten since morning, a half-stale roll and some coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. Hunger was one thing, but the loneliness, that quiet, bone-deep kind that was harder to swallow. Then I saw her. She came from the side alley, holding a small umbrella and a plastic grocery bag pressed against her chest. Gray hair tied back in a loose knot, a worn brown coat that had seen better winters. She stopped when she noticed me, or rather, noticed the car with fogged windows and a man sitting inside with no destination. For a moment I looked away, embarrassed. I didn't want pity, didn't want to be seen as someone who'd lost his place in the world. But when I glanced back, she was walking straight toward me. She tapped on the glass, knuckles light against the window. I hesitated, then rolled it down an inch. "You look cold," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Are you living out of that car?" I tried to smile, just between homes. She studied me for a moment, not unkindly. Then she reached into the grocery bag and pulled out a small container. "It's chicken soup," she said, "still warm." I started to shake my head, instinctively refusing, but she pressed it gently onto the window ledge. Please, it's too much for me anyway. The smell hit me before I even opened it, broth, garlic, and a hint of thyme. It was the first real food I'd smelled in weeks that didn't come wrapped in paper. I took it carefully, the heat seeping into my fingers like mercy. "Thank you," I murmured. "You didn't have to." "I know," she interrupted with a small smile. "But sometimes doing what we don't have to do is the only thing that keeps us human." She stepped back, umbrella tilting against the rain, and I realized I recognized her. It took me a moment, but the memory came, Mrs. Mary Thompson. She used to live 3 houses down from us. Her husband was the one who'd helped me replace the fence after that summer storm years ago. She must have seen the recognition on my face because her eyes softened. "Frank Carter," she said quietly. "I thought that was you, I wasn't sure." I nodded, throat tight. "It's been a while." She didn't ask what happened, didn't mention the rumors or the house or Evan. Instead, she looked at me the way people do when they've already decided not to judge. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather," she said. "There's a spare room at my place. It's not much, but it's warm." I wanted to refuse again, pride rising like an old reflex, but something in her tone made it impossible. It wasn't charity, it was invitation. Her house hadn't changed much. Same white porch, same hanging wind chime that sang softly every time the wind passed. The air inside smelled faintly of cinnamon and detergent. A tabby cat blinked at me from the couch, then went back to sleep. She handed me a towel and pointed toward the small guest room near the back. "Bathroom's down the hall. There's hot water if you let it run for a minute." When I came out, the smell of soup filled the kitchen again. She'd made more, this time with bread toasted on a skillet. The warmth hit me before the gratitude could form words. We sat at the small table, the rain tapping softly against the window now, gentler somehow. Mary talked about ordinary things. The town, the bakery that had closed down, the new neighbors who didn't wave much. She didn't ask about Evan, though I knew she wanted to. At one point she said, almost to herself, "It's funny, isn't it? The people we help the least are often the ones we love the most." Then she looked at me, her eyes steady. "When my husband passed, people brought casseroles for a week, then stopped calling. Grief makes everyone uncomfortable, but the loneliness, that stays." I nodded slowly. "I guess I thought I could fix mine by fixing him," I said quietly. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand light on mine. "You can't rebuild someone else's house when your own roof is caving in," she said. After dinner, she gave me a folded quilt and pointed toward the guest bed. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and something floral. As I lay down, the sheets cool against my skin, I realized how foreign comfort felt. The rain had stopped. The house creaked softly, the sound of a place that was alive, not haunted. For the first time in months, I slept. Not the shallow, restless kind that comes from exhaustion, but real sleep, the kind that lets you forget where you are, if only for a while. When morning came, sunlight spilled across the room through half-open blinds. Mary was already in the kitchen, humming something old and slow. She handed me a mug of coffee, steam curling up between us. "I can't stay long," I said. "Didn't mean to trouble you." She smiled. "It's no trouble. But promise me one thing, when you get back on your feet, you'll pass it on." I promised. As I walked back to the car, the air felt different. Lighter. The frost on the windshield caught the morning light and glimmered like glass dust. I started the engine, the sound rough but alive. In the rearview mirror, I saw Mary standing on the porch, one hand raised, the other holding that same old umbrella. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel like a man waiting to disappear. Sometimes, all it takes is a bowl of soup to remind you that you still belong to the world, even when the world has forgotten your name. It was Mary who found it first. She came into the kitchen one morning holding a stack of mail she'd picked up from the post office box she'd let me use. Most of it was junk, credit card offers, folded flyers, a notice for a car I didn't own anymore. But at the bottom was an envelope from the bank. Her hand hesitated as she passed it to me. "No return address," she said softly, "but it looks official." The paper felt thin, almost translucent between my fingers. I hadn't seen that logo in months. I set down my coffee, broke the seal, and unfolded the statement. The numbers hit me first, black ink against white paper, neat and cold. My checking account, withdrawals, transfers. And then at the bottom, a transaction that made my stomach twist. A cashier's check, the one I'd written for Evan. deposited not by any treatment center but into a private account. The date was stamped only 2 days after he'd come to me, eyes wide, voice trembling, talking about redemption and second chances. The room went quiet. The only sound was the faint tick of Mary's kitchen clock. Each second landed like a hammer. I stared at that piece of paper until the edges blurred. For months I'd convinced myself he was out west, rebuilding, recovering. I'd pictured him in sunlight, surrounded by counselors and clean air, his life unfolding again. But the truth was printed right there, neat lines, official font, no room for denial. He hadn't gone anywhere. He'd taken the money and stayed exactly where he was. I folded the statement once, twice, then placed it back on the table. My hands were trembling. Mary didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence between us said everything. That afternoon I drove back toward town. The sky was overcast, clouds hanging low like wet cotton. Every mile felt heavier. I didn't know what I was going to do: confront him, forgive him, beg him to explain, maybe all three. All I knew was that the truth had burned a hole in whatever illusion I'd been living in. The drive to the house felt shorter this time. I knew the turns too well, the cracks in the road where weeds pushed through the asphalt. When I pulled up across from the house, there was a different car in the driveway, sleek silver, not his. I killed the engine, sat there watching. A woman came out carrying a box. She wasn't someone I recognized. Younger, stylish, sunglasses even in the dull light. Evan followed behind her. He looked worse than before, gaunt, unshaven, wearing clothes that hung off him like loose skin. They loaded boxes into the car, laughing about something I couldn't hear. When he turned toward the street for a moment, his eyes swept past me without recognition. Then he looked again and froze. He walked over slowly, the way a man approaches something he'd hoped to avoid. When he reached my window, he leaned down, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad," he said like a question. "Got your bank statement," I replied quietly. The smile faltered, he swallowed. "Look, I can explain." I opened the door before he could finish. The cold air hit both of us. "You told me you needed that money for rehab," I said, voice steady. "For help." "I did," he said quickly, hands lifting in defense. "I was going to go, but things got complicated." "Complicated," I repeated. The word tasted bitter. "Complicated is when the car won't start. Complicated isn't stealing from the man who sold his home to save you." He stepped back, glancing toward the woman still packing boxes. "Can we not do this here?" he muttered. "Please." I followed his gaze. "She know?" I asked. His jaw clenched. "Don't drag her into this." I took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "I'm not here for her, Evan. I'm here for the truth." He looked down, kicking at the gravel. For a moment I thought he might finally break, but when he spoke his tone hardened. "I didn't ask you to sell the house. You did that, you made that choice. Don't make me the villain for your guilt." The words hit harder than I expected. So that was what I was now, a man blamed for his own compassion. I felt my pulse in my temples. "You think I did that out of guilt?" I said quietly. "I did it because I still believed you were worth saving." He didn't answer. His silence said he didn't. The woman called from the car. "Evan, we need to go." He turned, nodded, then looked back at me one last time. "I'll pay you back," he said, "someday." I laughed once, a small, broken sound. "It's not about the money, son." He waited. I met his eyes, the same eyes that used to light up over birthday candles, that once looked at me like I hung the stars. Now they were hollow, flat. "It's about what you became when you stopped needing me," I said. He said nothing. Then he turned and walked away. I stood there long after the car disappeared, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and wet earth. In my pocket, the folded bank statement crinkled like an accusation. I pulled it out, stared at the ink one last time, and felt something inside me shift. Not anger, not even sadness, but something sharper. The kind of resolve that comes when you realize love without boundaries isn't kindness. It's surrender. I looked back at the house, the same one I'd built, painted and lost, and whispered, "Not anymore." The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the porch, and for the first time in months, I turned away from it. The day after seeing him, I didn't get out of bed. Mary knocked twice that morning, asking if I wanted breakfast. I told her I wasn't hungry. She left a plate outside the door anyway, toast, jam, and a small note that simply read, "You did what you could." But those words didn't make it easier. They only echoed the hollow truth: I had done what I could, and it still wasn't enough. The bank statement lay on the nightstand beside me, folded and unfolded so many times that the edges had started to tear. I stared at it until the numbers blurred, then I picked up the phone and dialed the bank again, just to make sure it was real. The voice on the other end confirmed what I already knew. The check had been cashed under Evan's personal account, and the funds were withdrawn in full within 48 hours. 48 hours. That's how long it took for a lifetime of work to disappear. By noon, I was sitting in Mary's kitchen, the phone resting in my hand. The sunlight spilled through the curtains in narrow stripes, landing across the table where my coffee had gone cold. Mary looked at me over her glasses. "You can't just sit here, Frank. You've got to do something." "Do what?" I muttered. "He's my son." She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "And you're a person. A father, yes, but also a man who deserves to be treated right. Love doesn't mean letting someone destroy you." Her words hit harder than I expected. Maybe because no one had said them out loud before. She slid a small card across the table. "My brother used to handle property disputes. He's retired now, but he still knows people. Call this man. He can tell you what your options are." The card was simple, just a name, Daniel Whitman, and a number written in blue ink. I turned it over once, twice, then tucked it into my pocket. It felt heavier than paper should. That evening I sat in the car outside the library, the only place left in town where no one asked questions. The parking lot lights buzzed faintly, throwing long shadows across the dashboard. I dialed the number. The line rang twice before a voice answered, low, steady, professional. "Whitman Law, Daniel speaking." I cleared my throat. "Mr. Whitman, my name's Frank Carter. I was referred to you by Mary Thompson. I need some advice." He asked me to explain, so I told him everything: the sale, the check, the house, the lock on the door. I didn't raise my voice, didn't embellish. I just told it straight. By the time I finished, there was silence on the other end. Finally, he said, "Mr. Carter, it sounds like your son engaged in what could be considered fraudulent inducement. You may have legal standing to reclaim your property or at least file a civil claim for the funds." "Fraudulent inducement," I repeated slowly. It sounded clinical, detached, like calling heartbreak by its legal name. "What would that mean exactly?" "It means," he said carefully, "that if we can prove he obtained your money through deception, false promises, intent to misuse, then the court can act. But it won't be easy. It'll take time, paperwork, and resolve." Resolve, that word sat with me. He asked me to bring documentation, any receipts, emails, letters, even the brochure from the fake rehab. I promised to find them. Before hanging up, he said something that lingered long after the call ended. "Mr. Carter, I've worked on a lot of family cases. They're the hardest kind, because justice doesn't always feel like peace, but sometimes it's the only way forward." The line clicked, and the silence that followed was different this time, not empty but deliberate. I drove back to Mary's, the night stretching wide and colorless around me. Every streetlight hummed with that faint electric sound that makes you feel more alone than darkness ever could. I parked in front of the house and sat there, watching the porch light sway gently in the wind. Inside my chest, something unfamiliar was stirring, not anger exactly, but clarity. When I went inside, Mary was reading in the living room. She looked up as I entered. "Well, I called him," I said, "and he's going to take the case." She nodded once as if she'd been expecting that answer. "You're doing the right thing, Frank. I don't know if it feels right," I admitted. "It feels heavy." "Maybe it's not about what feels right," she said. "Maybe it's about what stops the bleeding." That night I pulled out an old box from the back of my car, the one with papers I hadn't touched since the sale. Contracts, receipts, mortgage statements, even a photo of the house taken years ago with Evan sitting on the porch steps, grinning at something his mother said. I spread them out on Mary's kitchen table, the lamplight turning the papers gold. Every signature felt like a ghost of good intentions. In the middle of it all was the check stub, my handwriting, my promise. Next to it I placed the bank statement. Evidence. Proof. But looking at them didn't bring satisfaction. It just brought a dull ache, the kind that settles in your bones and refuses to leave. Before I went to bed, I wrote Daniel's name and appointment time on a scrap of paper. Tomorrow, I'd drive into the city. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of taking my life back, or what was left of it. As I turned off the light, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. The man staring back looked older than I remembered, tired but steadier somehow. The kind of steady that comes from running out of ways to keep forgiving. I stood there for a long time, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the clock ticking on the wall, and somewhere outside, the faint rustle of wind against the trees. All small sounds, ordinary, grounding, but they felt like the world shifting slightly back into place. Because that night, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for my son to come home. I was waiting for justice to begin. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and polish, that sterile mix of bureaucracy and history. Everything about it felt heavy. The marble floors, the wooden benches, even the air itself, thick with whispers and the soft shuffle of feet. Daniel walked beside me, a calm presence in a gray suit. He carried the files like they were ammunition, each folder labeled, each page ready to speak where I no longer could. I hadn't been in a courtroom since the day I signed the deed over. Now I was back, not as a seller, not as a father, but as a man trying to reclaim what truth still belonged to him. When we entered, Evan was already there. He sat on the opposite side of the room next to his attorney, his posture stiff, jaw tight. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he'd filled out some, gained back a little color, but smaller in spirit, like someone pretending to be taller than the weight he carried. He didn't look at me. Not once. The judge entered, gavel tapping once, the sound echoing across the chamber like a gunshot. "Case of Carter v. Carter," the clerk announced. The irony wasn't lost on me. A father and son, the same name, now separated by verses. Daniel rose first. He spoke with that steady tone lawyers use when they've done their homework, precise, unshakable, almost surgical. "Your Honor," he began, "we will demonstrate that the defendant, Mr. Evan Carter, obtained funds from his father, Mr. Frank Carter, under false pretenses, specifically through a fabricated rehabilitation scheme." I sat there, hands clasped together, listening to my life reduced to exhibits and statements. Emails, bank records, the counterfeit brochure. Each one slid neatly across the table, each one a blade disguised as paper. When they displayed the copies of the check and the withdrawal slips, my stomach turned. I could see my handwriting projected on the screen, the shaky signature of a man who believed love could be measured in zeros. Daniel's voice cut through the hush. This was not a loan. It was a lie. Evan's lawyer objected, of course. He argued that my son hadn't technically committed fraud, that the transaction was voluntary, that no written contract had been breached. He used words like intent, burden of proof, misunderstanding. All I heard was the desperate rhythm of someone trying to make deception sound like an accident. Then they called Evan to the stand. He walked slowly, avoiding my eyes. When he raised his right hand to take the oath, it trembled slightly. The bailiff nodded for him to sit, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink around him. Daniel approached. "Mr. Carter," he said evenly, "is it true your father provided you with a check totaling $120,000? Evan nodded. "Yes." "And is it true you told him the money was required for an inpatient treatment program located in California?" "Yes." Daniel paused. "Mr. Carter, can you provide documentation of your enrollment in this program? Any receipts, correspondence, or proof of attendance?" Silence. Evan's lawyer shifted in his chair. "No," Evan said finally, his voice barely audible. "Why not?" He swallowed. "I never went." A quiet ripple passed through the courtroom, that soft, collective intake of breath when the truth finally steps out of the shadows. The judge leaned forward. "You never went," Evan shook his head. "I thought I would, I wanted to, but things changed." Daniel didn't let him retreat into excuses. "What changed, Mr. Carter? You had the money, you had the plan. What happened to it?" Evan stared at the floor. "I used it for bills," he said weakly. Then, after a pause, "and other things." My throat tightened. "Other things." We both knew what that meant. Daniel's voice softened. "Mr. Carter, did your father ever tell you he expected repayment?" "No," Evan said. "Did he tell you that the money was unconditional?" He hesitated. "No, he said it was for help, that it was my last chance." "And did you help yourself with it?" Evan looked up then, not at Daniel, not at the judge, but at me. His eyes, once so full of fight, looked hollow now. "No," he said, "I didn't." The words hung there, simple, unadorned, the kind of truth that doesn't need shouting to be heard. Daniel nodded once, then quietly said, "No further questions." When Evan stepped down, his lawyer didn't cross-examine. There was nothing left to spin. No story left to sell. The judge spoke next, her tone measured, impartial, yet not unkind. "Mr. Carter," she said, turning to me, "the court acknowledges your loss, both financial and personal. Based on the evidence and testimony, we find sufficient grounds to declare the transaction fraudulent under civil statute. Restitution will be pursued through asset recovery." I barely heard the rest. The gavel struck once, a single, sharp sound that split the air. The case was closed. Evan remained seated as the courtroom emptied. His shoulders sagged, hands folded in his lap. I stood slowly, watching him, not as an enemy, not even as a victim, but as a father standing on the far side of a bridge that had finally burned itself out. When I reached the aisle, he looked up at me. There was something raw in his expression, shame, maybe, or the faint beginning of regret. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. Neither of us spoke. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry." I nodded, "Me too," and that was it. No dramatic reconciliation, no embrace. Just two men in a quiet room, each finally admitting what love can't fix. As I stepped outside, the late afternoon light hit me, sharp, honest, unfiltered. The air smelled faintly of rain and city dust, and for the first time in years I felt something like balance. Not victory, just release. The kind that comes when the truth, after hiding for too long, finally speaks, and everyone, even a broken father, learns to listen. The sentence was handed down on a Wednesday morning. The air outside the courthouse carried that strange mix of warmth and wind that comes when autumn hasn't decided whether to stay or leave. The leaves along the sidewalk rattled like dry paper. I didn't sit inside for the verdict. Daniel had offered to stand in for me, but I came anyway, not to watch my son be punished, but to make sure someone was there who still remembered the boy he once was. Evan stood at the defendant's table, wearing the same jacket he used to shovel the driveway in when he was 16. It didn't fit anymore. He looked smaller beneath the fluorescent lights, the kind that flatten every color into gray. The judge's voice was even, deliberate. Her words filled the room, crisp as glass. Given the evidence presented and the defendant's cooperation with recovery proceedings, the court sentences Mr. Evan Carter to 6 months in a state rehabilitation facility under judicial supervision, followed by 2 years of probation and restitution payments. 6 months. The same amount of time he'd spent disappearing from me. The symmetry felt cruel. When the gavel struck, the sound barely registered. Evan didn't move. He just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on something that wasn't there. I wanted to feel relief. Justice, maybe. But what settled in my chest was something colder, the quiet understanding that justice doesn't heal, it only balances the scales. And balance doesn't bring back what love has already lost. The bailiff motioned for him to step forward. Evan turned, and for a moment our eyes met. He looked older than his years, lines etched deep around a face that had once been so open, so full of light. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words never came. Then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and just like that he was led away. Outside, the sunlight hit hard after the dimness of the courtroom. The city noise rushed back in, car horns, voices, the faint hum of life continuing. Daniel walked beside me in silence until we reached the bottom of the courthouse steps. "You did what needed to be done," he said quietly. I nodded, though the words didn't fit right. "What I did," I murmured, "was watch my son lose everything." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Sometimes losing everything is the only way some people learn what they've had." I wanted to believe that. I really did. The following weeks passed like a slow exhale. Paperwork, phone calls, quiet evenings in Mary's kitchen. Every night she'd make tea and sit across from me while I read the letters Daniel forwarded, updates on restitution, court documents, forms to sign. I read them all, but the words felt hollow. They talked about property and repayment, about timelines and compliance. None of it mentioned the thing that mattered most, the silence. Because that's what came next. After the courtroom, after the sentence, after the moment of truth, the silence returned. Not the empty kind from before, but something heavier, like a pause between two heartbeats. I didn't call him. He didn't call me. We existed on opposite sides of forgiveness, each waiting for the other to move first. Every morning I still drove past the house. It had been repossessed by the bank and sat empty now, windows boarded, yard overgrown. Sometimes I'd park across the street for a few minutes, just to remind myself that it was real, that we had once filled that place with laughter and noise and something close to love. One morning, a for sale sign went up. The metal creaked softly in the wind, a small white rectangle standing where the mailbox used to be. I watched a realtor hammer it into the ground, her movements efficient, impersonal. She didn't know she was driving a nail into the heart of a memory. I stayed until she left. Then I walked up to the porch. The boards creaked beneath my shoes. Through a gap in the boards over the window, I could see faint traces of our old life, the shadow of where the couch had been, a patch of lighter paint where a picture once hung. The air inside smelled like dust and rain. I pressed my hand against the glass and whispered, "You did your best, old friend." Maybe I was talking to the house, maybe to myself. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at Mary's, plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of lined paper, handwritten shaky like it had been started and stopped a dozen times. "Dad, I don't know what to say that you'd believe. I don't expect you to forgive me. The rehab's different this time. They don't let us make calls, only write letters. I'm doing what they tell me, trying to be better. I keep thinking about Mom, about you, about the house. I know I broke it all. Maybe one day I'll know how to build again. E." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the table. Mary asked if I was all right. I nodded, though my throat felt raw. "I think he's finally learning what silence is for," I said. That night I walked outside. The air was cool, clean, carrying the faint scent of rain and pine. Above me the stars were scattered thin, dim but steady. Somewhere out there my son was looking at the same sky. Maybe not at the same time, but enough that it made me feel, for the first time in years, like we weren't completely lost to each other. The world around me was quiet again, but it wasn't the cruel kind of quiet anymore. It was a waiting quiet, the kind that holds space for something not yet broken, something that might still return. And for once I didn't fill it with words. I just stood there, letting the silence settle. Because sometimes silence isn't what comes after the pain. It's what makes healing possible. The day I got the key back, the sky was the color of pewter. A light drizzle hung in the air, not quite rain, not quite mist, the kind that settles quietly into your collar and makes you feel heavier without realizing why. The realtor met me on the porch. She was polite, efficient, all business. The kind of person who could talk about square footage without ever noticing the ghosts inside a house. She handed me the key, metal cold against my palm. "The property's officially returned to your name," she said. "The court's restitution cleared the title this morning." Her voice carried that faint, rehearsed brightness people use when they're standing too close to someone else's grief. I thanked her and waited until she drove away before turning toward the door. The lock turned easily. Too easily. And just like that, after years of noise, chaos, and silence, I was standing inside my home again. The air had that hollow scent of disuse, dust, wood, and the faint, stale sweetness of something long gone bad. I left the door open for light and stepped inside. The sound of my footsteps echoed up the stairs and down the hall, bouncing off bare walls that once carried framed photographs and laughter. The living room looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe because it was empty. No couch, no table, no life. Just a patch of lighter paint where our wedding picture used to hang. A pale rectangle floating on the wall, like a ghost of memory. I walked slowly, hand brushing along the banister I'd built myself the year Evan was born. There was a small chip near the middle, right where his toy car had slammed into it when he was 6. I ran my thumb over it and smiled, that soft, involuntary kind of smile that hurts as much as it heals. In the kitchen, the tiles were cracked. The faucet dripped, steady and rhythmic, like a clock marking time in drops. I could almost see Claire there, standing by the stove, stirring soup, humming something soft and half forgotten. The room still held her in some invisible way, like sunlight that lingers even after the sun has moved on. I opened a cabinet. Inside, an old mug sat on the top shelf, chipped along the rim, faded with age. It was Evan's favorite once. He'd painted it at a school fair, the word DAD etched in uneven blue letters across the front. I took it down carefully, dust clinging to my fingers, and set it on the counter. For a moment I just stared at it, the smallest thing in the room, yet somehow the loudest. Upstairs, the air felt colder. The carpet crunched faintly under my shoes, a thin film of grit and plaster from where the ceiling had started to peel. I pushed open Evan's old bedroom door. The hinges groaned, the same familiar protest they'd always made. The room was bare except for the faint outlines left behind by furniture, rectangles of unfaded carpet where his bed and desk once stood. The window was cracked slightly, letting in a draft that smelled of rain and dirt. I walked to it and looked out at the yard below, overgrown now, wild and untended but still ours. For a long time I didn't move. I just stood there, hand resting on the windowsill, feeling the cool air brush against my wrist. The silence in the room wasn't cruel this time. It felt patient, as if the house itself was waiting for me to breathe again. I wandered back downstairs and sat on the floor in the living room. The hardwood was cool beneath me. I leaned my back against the wall and closed my eyes. It was strange, sitting in the same spot where so much had happened. Christmas mornings, family dinners, arguments that lasted too long, apologies that came too late. And yet, without the furniture, without the noise, it felt new. Not like a memory, but like a blank page. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the letter Evan had written from rehab, the one I'd folded so many times the creases had begun to tear. I read it again, slowly, letting each word land where it needed to. He'd written another since then, shorter but clearer. He said he was clean, that he was working at the center now, helping other people find their way through the same darkness he'd known. He didn't ask for forgiveness, just said he hoped I was doing okay. Those two words, doing okay, carried more weight than any apology could. As the light outside dimmed, I stood and walked through the house one last time. Every room hummed with its own quiet, different shades of stillness layered like paint. The hallway smelled faintly of old pine and dust. The upstairs floor creaked under its own memory. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked older but steadier, the kind of face that had finally stopped asking why and started asking what now. I turned off the lights, closed the front door behind me, and locked it. This time, the sound of the bolt sliding home didn't feel like loss. It felt like punctuation, the end of one sentence, the breath before the next. On the porch, the rain had stopped. The clouds had lifted just enough for a thin line of light to break through. It fell across the yard, catching on the wet grass, the kind of light that doesn't last long but promises to come again. I stood there a while, key still warm in my hand, listening. No voices, no echoes, just the faint hum of a world still turning. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the emptiness, because I finally understood the house wasn't waiting to be filled. It was waiting to be forgiven. It was early winter when I decided to write it. The kind of morning where frost clung to the windows in thin, trembling lines, and the air inside the house felt too still, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The furniture hadn't arrived yet, just a folding chair and an old desk I'd dragged in from the shed. The place echoed with every movement, footsteps, the soft scratch of a pen, the small sighs that slip out when you're thinking too much. The idea for the letter came the night before. I'd woken from a dream where Evan was little again, maybe 6 or 7, running barefoot down the hallway, his laughter bouncing off the walls. He stopped at my doorway, hair messy, cheeks flushed, and said, "Dad, come see the fort I built." When I woke, the sound of that laughter still clung to me like a memory that refused to let go. So I made coffee, sat by the window, and began to write. "Evan, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe it's better if you don't. But I need to write it, not for forgiveness, not even for understanding. Just so there's something in the world that says I still loved you, even when I stopped trying to save you." The pen moved slowly at first, hesitating between lines. The ink bled slightly into the paper, softening the edges of the words, as if they too were unsure of their shape. "You were born on a Sunday morning. The light came through the hospital blinds like a promise. Your mother cried before she even saw you. She said she could feel your heartbeat from across the room. I think that was the moment she fell in love with being alive again. For me, it was when you wrapped your hand around my finger. You were so small, but your grip was strong. You've always been strong, even when you forgot how to use it." I paused, letting the ink dry. Outside, a crow perched on the fence, its feathers black against the snow. It cawed once, sharp and echoing, before taking flight. I envied the ease with which it left, no hesitation, no need to look back. I don't blame you for everything that happened. Addiction is a kind of gravity. It pulls, it consumes. It convinces you that falling is the same as flying. I've watched it turn good men into strangers, kind hearts into ghosts. But what I didn't understand back then was how much it also swallows the people who love you. The words came faster now, tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. I thought if I just gave enough time, money, patience, faith, I could pull you back. I didn't realize that sometimes love, when misused, becomes the rope that drags you down with the drowning. I leaned back, rubbing the cramp in my hand. The paper in front of me looked fragile, thin veins of ink tracing the outline of years I could never rewrite. I thought about the day of the courtroom, the way his eyes had flickered when he said, "I'm sorry." I'd replayed that moment 100 times since, wondering if he meant it, wondering if it mattered. Because maybe sorry isn't a word. Maybe it's just a door, cracked open, waiting for someone to walk through. I took another sip of coffee, cold now, bitter as truth. Then I kept writing. I still see you everywhere. In the boy who bags groceries at the store, in the sound of an engine starting late at night. I even hear you in my own voice sometimes when I get angry too quickly, when I use that same tone that used to make you shut down. Maybe that's how we stay connected, even after everything, in the echoes of what we never learned to say right. The light outside shifted, gray giving way to the dull blue of late afternoon. Snow began to fall again, slow and deliberate, blanketing the yard in quiet. I wrote until the words blurred, until my hand ached and my chest felt hollow. If you ever come back here, you'll find the house changed. It's emptier now, but it's clean, peaceful, even. Your old room still smells faintly of pine and dust. I fixed the window latch that used to rattle in the wind. I guess I did that for me, not for you. I needed to believe that something could still be mended. I stopped then. The pen hovered above the page. My throat tightened. The next words felt too heavy, too final, but they came anyway. I forgive you, Evan, for all of it. For the lies, for the lock on the door, for leaving me with silence. Because I finally understand, forgiveness isn't about letting you off the hook. It's about setting myself free from the weight of waiting for you to come back. When I finished, the room had grown dark. The only light came from the street lamp outside, spilling in through the window in soft, uneven stripes. I read the letter once more, slowly, tracing each line with my eyes. Then I folded it, slid it into an envelope, and wrote his name across the front. No address, just Evan. I set it on the windowsill. The paper caught the faint glow of the streetlight, almost translucent, almost alive. For a moment I thought about mailing it. Then I didn't. Some words are meant to stay between the heart and the page. I blew out the candle on the desk, the smoke curling upward like a sigh. In the dark, the house seemed to settle, the soft creak of wood, the distant hum of the wind outside. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. Because I'd finally said everything I never could. And even if he never read it, he'd always know. It's been 2 years now. 2 winters, 2 summers, and 1,000 small silences in between. The house is no longer empty, not quite full, but alive in a quieter way. The walls no longer echo, they breathe. I've rebuilt most of it myself, new paint on the living room walls, new curtains that catch the morning light just right. Out back, I've planted a small garden. Tomatoes, mint, and a stubborn little rose bush that refuses to bloom all at once. Every morning I water it, watching how some petals open early while others take their time. That's how healing feels, I think, uneven, unpredictable, but still happening. I never mailed the letter. It still sits inside the top drawer of my desk, folded neatly, edges worn soft from being opened and read more times than I'll ever admit. Some nights, when the wind picks up and the old trees outside start whispering, I take it out again, not to add to it, not to change it, but to remember that I once had the courage to write it. The last time I saw Evan, it was spring. He just completed his rehab program and was working at the center as a mentor. He asked to meet at a small cafe halfway between his town and mine. I remember arriving early, nerves buzzing in my stomach like static. I didn't know what to expect. When he walked in, he looked older. Not older the way addicts sometimes do, sunken eyes and broken skin, but older in the way a man becomes when life finally teaches him humility. He was clean-shaven, his shoulders looked steady. He smiled, hesitant, unsure, and for the first time in years I saw a trace of the boy I'd raised. "Hi, Dad," he said, simple, unassuming, but it cracked something open in me. We talked for hours, about ordinary things, the weather, work, his meetings, the food at the center cafeteria. Terrible, he joked, and I laughed because it felt good to. He told me about the people he helped, young men who looked just like him, who had fathers who'd stopped answering their calls. "I tell them they're lucky," he said quietly, "because I still had someone who tried. I wanted to tell him I'd almost stopped trying, that I'd almost let the silence win, but I didn't. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be understood. When the check came, he reached for it. "I've got this," he said, and though it was only $15, it meant everything. On the drive home, I thought about something the judge had said during sentencing, a line I'd barely heard at the time but now couldn't shake. Some debts are paid in time, not money. Back then, I'd thought it was a metaphor. Now I knew it was a truth. Evan didn't owe me repayment. He owed himself redemption, and that's something no court, no father, no God can grant. It has to be earned in silence, one day at a time. And maybe that's what love becomes when it grows old. Not the kind that demands or fixes or chases, but the kind that waits quietly, believing that no soul is too far gone to find its way home. Months later, I got a letter in the mail from him this time. The handwriting was steadier. Inside was a photo. He stood in front of the rehab center, arms around two young men. They were smiling, eyes bright, like the world hadn't yet beaten them down. At the bottom, he'd written, "Still clean, still trying, thank you for not locking the door forever." I sat there for a long time, holding that picture under the light. Something inside me softened, not forgiveness, not pride, something gentler, peace maybe. A kind of peace that doesn't erase the pain but lets it rest. Would I still call him son? People have asked me that in one form or another. Sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes judgment. How do you love someone who's broken you like that? How do you ever trust them again? How do you still call him your child? And the truth is, I don't know that love like this fits neatly into an answer. It's not rational. It doesn't follow rules. It's raw, human, flawed. If you've ever watched someone you love destroy themselves, you know what I mean. There comes a point where anger burns out, disappointment goes quiet, and all that's left is something softer than forgiveness. A kind of surrender that says, I can't save you, but I won't stop seeing you as mine. So yes, I still call him son. Not because he deserves it, but because that word isn't about deserving. It's about belonging. One evening not long ago, I returned to the house after sunset. The sky was bruised purple, fading into blue. Through the window, the living room glowed with the warm, amber light of the old lamp Claire once loved. For the first time in years, it didn't feel haunted. I sat in the chair by the window, the rose bush outside barely visible in the dusk. It hadn't bloomed yet that season, but I knew it would. It always did in its own time. I thought about Evan, where he might be that night, whether he still carried guilt or if he'd finally learned to live with it. I hoped he'd found some small joy, the kind that doesn't depend on forgiveness, only on acceptance. I picked up a notebook and wrote just 3 words: I still believe. Not in miracles, not in happy endings, but in second chances that don't look like redemption, only quiet endurance. In the kind of love that survives not because it's easy, but because it refuses to stop trying. And now, sitting here telling you this story, I realize it was never just about a father and a son. It was about the fine line between mercy and madness, how loving someone through their darkness will test the limits of who you are. It was about letting go without abandoning, and learning that sometimes the only way to hold on is by finally releasing your grip. So if you're listening to this right now, maybe you're a parent carrying a silent heartbreak. Maybe you're the child who thinks it's too late to come home. Maybe you're just someone who's been holding on to a mistake for too long. Here's what I've learned. People don't change because we beg them to. They change because one day, the weight of who they've become finally hurts more than the effort it takes to be better. And our job as parents, as lovers, as friends, is not to pull them out of the dark, but to keep a light burning in case they ever find their way back. So yes, if you ask me today, would you still call him son? I'd say yes, because love, when it's real, doesn't vanish. It bends, it bruises, it waits in the quiet, but it never disappears. And maybe that's what being a parent really means. Not fixing everything, but loving even through what can't be fixed. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched something in you, even a little, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you've lost, then maybe that's what stories like this are for. To remind us that we're not alone in our brokenness. That healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning how to carry the memory without letting it crush you. If you found meaning in this, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment to share your own story, and pass this video to someone who might need it. Until next time, take care of yourself, love the people you still have, and never underestimate the quiet power of forgiveness. This is Stories family, wishing you peace, strength, and a home that's always warm, no matter how cold the world gets.